My father once told me, quite bluntly, that I could never measure up to my sister. He didn't say it in a moment of anger or frustration. He said it quietly while sipping his morning coffee, as if it were a plain fact he wanted me to accept. I remember the coil of shame tightening in my stomach, the sense that my own parent was looking right through me, toward a daughter he deemed better. It turned out my sister wasn't just better, she was extraordinary in his eyes, all because she had become the mistress of a man rumored to be worth $700 million. In my parents' world, that was all it took to become the favored child. It all started a couple of years ago when my sister Lauren first introduced our parents to Maxwell. He was a well-dressed, silver-haired man in his early 50s, polished from head to toe, with a watch that gleamed under the dining room light. I had never seen them beam so brightly as when they learned of his wealth. Though the specifics remained a bit murky, everyone in the room seemed to decide right then that this man was practically a mythical creature. My parents didn't care that Lauren was stepping into the morally gray role of mistress. They only cared about the money attached to that label. The favoritism was nothing new. From as far back as I could remember, Lauren was always the cherished child, the golden girl. She got the best compliments, the biggest share of attention, the warmest hugs. Meanwhile, I was the afterthought. I often blamed it on our age difference. She was 4 years older, so by the time I came around, maybe our parents had spent their nurturing energy on her. But as we both became adults, the disparity only widened. She was the family treasure. I was the exhibit no one bothered to look at. Still, the idea of her becoming someone's mistress felt like an abrupt plot twist. We were raised in a fairly conservative environment. Church on Sundays, prayers before dinner. I'd have expected our parents to gasp in disapproval. But ironically, that never happened. It was like the halo of his wealth canceled out any moral or ethical concerns. They offered no lectures, no condemnation, only starry-eyed enthusiasm that their elder daughter had snagged a man so powerful. I remember standing off to the side during those first few dinners, watching how my father nodded in approval at every word Maxwell uttered, how my mother giggled at his jokes as if this was the best thing that could have ever happened to our family. Lauren herself exuded pride whenever she was around them. It was as if she was saying, "Look what I've accomplished." Once the initial shock wore off, I approached her privately, asking if this was really the life she wanted, being someone's secret. She brushed me off with a flippant wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "Secret? I'm hardly a secret," she said. "He's separated from his wife. This is a formality. Soon he'll be divorced and I'll be the official partner." It was a story full of half-truths, but I didn't push further. Part of me worried that pressing too hard would spark a fight, and I wasn't sure I could handle the tension. From then on, my parents worshipped the ground Lauren walked on. Family gatherings turned into celebrations of her success. They'd fawn over her designer clothes, marvel at how Maxwell had whisked her away on a private jet for a weekend in Italy, or how he gifted her a brand new car. If I tried to talk about my job, an admittedly modest position at a local marketing firm, they'd nod politely but swiftly redirect the conversation back to Lauren. "But we're so proud of your sister, you know. Maxwell is worth $700 million. That's something to admire," my mother would chime. Even the word mistress became taboo in our household. They almost never uttered it, preferring euphemisms like his partner or his companion. At first, I tried to swallow my resentment. After all, we were grown-ups, each forging our own paths. I told myself that I should be happy for Lauren, that maybe her route, unorthodox as it was, would genuinely lead her to fulfillment. But it wasn't just about the relationship she'd chosen. It was the way our parents' love and approval seemed to hinge on that glittering wealth. The older I got, the more I realized how starved I was for a sliver of the attention they showered on her. No matter what I did, it never seemed enough to make them proud. I recall one instance, my 25th birthday, when I invited everyone over to my tiny apartment for a celebration. It was a tight fit, but I decorated the space with streamers and balloons, planning to serve a homemade cake. My parents showed up an hour late, and Lauren arrived even later, flaunting a brand new handbag that Maxwell had bought for her. The entire evening revolved around that handbag, where he got it, how much it cost, the story behind it. It was as if my birthday was just a minor footnote next to the spectacle of Lauren's luxury. By the time the night ended, my father was rhapsodizing about Maxwell's investment portfolio, and my mother had practically memorized the brand name of every item of Lauren's outfit. I, the birthday girl, felt like an invisible guest at my own party. Slowly, I distanced myself from all of them. I stopped making an effort to invite them places, and I found reasons to skip out on family dinners. Work is piling up, I'd say, or I have a cold, even when I didn't. The truth was, Every time I saw them I left feeling drained and inadequate. The comparisons, the unsubtle remarks about how I should fix my hair like Lauren does or take more risks like Lauren, made me question my own worth. My parents never directly said I was a failure, but their enthusiasm for my sister's lifestyle implied it. Months turned into years and Lauren's arrangement with Maxwell seemed to solidify. But there were cracks beneath the shiny surface. Occasionally, in quieter moments, she admitted to me that Maxwell still wasn't divorced, that the separation was ongoing, and that his wife was a formidable adversary in the legal system. It didn't look like a formal wedding was in Lauren's near future. Yet my parents didn't seem to care about that detail. They clung to the fantasy that a lavish ceremony would eventually take place, and that Lauren would become the legitimate spouse of a near-billionaire. If I ever voiced doubts about that outcome, my mother would snap, "Don't be negative. You should be happy for your sister." I was never allowed to express my concerns. Meanwhile, my life progressed in smaller, more modest ways. I got promotions at work, started a side business selling homemade crafts, and managed to buy a small condo. Yet none of these milestones elicited more than a cursory, "Well, that's nice," from my parents. Even though I was carving out a stable, respectable life, it seemed trivial compared to the wealth swirling around Lauren. They treated me like I was living in black and white while she was in dazzling technicolor. But beneath Lauren's polished exterior, cracks were widening. One evening she showed up at my condo unexpectedly. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a half-empty bottle of wine. I barely had time to ask her what was wrong before she burst into tears, confessing that Maxwell was pulling away. "He's spending more time with his wife again," she said between sobs. "He says he needs to figure things out." My immediate reaction was sympathy, but I also felt a sharp pang of frustration. All these years she'd basked in the glow of his fortune, ignoring the moral complications. Now she was reaping the fallout. For the first time in a while, I felt like she truly needed me. I sat her down, gave her a glass of water, and listened to her heartbreak. She admitted she wasn't sure if Maxwell had other mistresses, or if he was genuinely trying to reconcile with his wife. In the midst of her sobs, she lamented, "What if I lose everything? What if I've built my entire life around a man who's never going to choose me in the end?" The vulnerability in her voice rattled me. This was so different from the confident sister who flaunted her lifestyle. She stayed the night on my couch. I made us both tea and we talked until the early hours of the morning. By the time she fell asleep, tears still glistening on her cheeks, I felt a strange mix of pity, sadness, and yes, resentment. A part of me wanted to say, "This is exactly what you signed up for," but I kept that to myself. Blood is thicker than water, and despite everything I still cared about Lauren. The next day I woke to find her rummaging in my fridge, looking utterly miserable. Without her trademark makeup, she appeared younger, more fragile. When she noticed me, she averted her gaze, likely embarrassed by her breakdown. We spoke briefly, and she confessed she was terrified to tell our parents the truth. "They'll be so disappointed," she sighed. "Dad especially. He thinks I've done this incredible thing for the family." I felt a surge of anger at our father for burdening her with that kind of expectation. But again I kept my bitterness in check. Over the next few weeks, Lauren tried to mend her relationship with Maxwell. She returned to the role of glamorous mistress, dining at upscale restaurants, posting pictures of her extravagant dates online. Yet every time I caught a glimpse of her social media, I wondered how much of it was an act. She seemed determined to keep the fantasy alive, at least for our parents' sake. Meanwhile, I found myself fielding phone calls from my mother, who raved about how well Lauren was doing, or about some new piece of jewelry Maxwell had purchased for her. I remained polite, but a part of me wanted to scream. "She cried on my couch all night. She's terrified of losing everything." But I knew they wouldn't believe me. They only believed the sparkling version of the story. About a month ago, something shifted in a big way. My parents announced a family dinner at a fancy restaurant, complete with reservations for a private room. "This is a celebration," my father told me over the phone, "and we want you there too." When I asked what we were celebrating, he dodged the question, only saying that Lauren had great news. My mind spun with possibilities. Maybe Maxwell had finally divorced his wife? Maybe there was a ring on Lauren's finger? The thought of yet another evening of them parading around Lauren's good fortune made my stomach twist in knots. Yet I reluctantly agreed to attend. One might call it morbid curiosity. Another part of me still longed for an invitation to be part of something important in the family. On the night of the dinner, I arrived at the restaurant feeling a mix of dread and resignation. Lauren was already there, resplendent in a figure-hugging black dress, her face set in a triumphant smile. My parents greeted me with lukewarm hugs, and I settled into a seat at the far end of the table. Maxwell was notably absent. "He's traveling for business," Lauren announced airily, as though that explained everything. Then came the great news. Lauren cleared her throat, beaming at our parents, and declared, "I'm pregnant." My mother shrieked with joy, and my father immediately stood up to hug her, his eyes shining. I sat there, shock coursing through me. My brain raced. Pregnant? That meant she'd be forever linked to Maxwell now. Or at least, that was the assumption. My parents were practically dancing around the table, babbling about grandchildren, how proud they were of Lauren, how this baby would be so lucky. Lauren glowed under their adoration. I tried to muster a smile, but inside I felt numb. I didn't know if I was supposed to be happy or terrified for her. The dinner was a whirlwind of congratulatory toasts and predictions about the future. My father even joked that he hoped Maxwell's fortune would extend to their soon-to-be grandchild. My mother went on about how this was the best news for our family legacy. Meanwhile, I picked at my food, feeling invisible again. No one asked for my thoughts. No one noticed how quiet I was. The entire evening revolved around a baby who hadn't even arrived yet. I watched Lauren accept their praises with a practiced grace, but I detected a flicker of anxiety in her eyes. 1 month passed, 30 days of emotional turbulence. I tried to check in on Lauren, but each time she was evasive. She'd say she was tired, or she had morning sickness, or Maxwell was calling and she had to run. During that time, our parents grew more and more delirious with happiness, already referring to themselves as Grandma and Grandpa, telling all their friends about the coming baby. I had never heard them so animated, so unabashedly joyful. But then everything unraveled. One morning I received a phone call from Lauren, her voice trembling. "I need to see you," she said. "I'm not okay." I dropped everything and drove over to her apartment, a lavish place presumably paid for by Maxwell. When she opened the door, she looked pale, eyes ringed with purple from crying. She didn't wait for me to take off my coat before launching into an avalanche of words. She'd lied about the pregnancy. That was her confession. She wasn't pregnant at all. She'd hoped that by announcing it she could somehow force Maxwell's hand, make him finally file for divorce, or at least commit to her publicly. She expected that if he believed she was carrying his child, he'd be compelled to step up, to appease our parents, to fulfill the fantasy everyone clung to. But Maxwell hadn't reacted the way she'd hoped. He accused her of manipulating him. She tried to maintain the lie for a while, but eventually, it collapsed under scrutiny. "He's furious," she whispered, her voice quaking. "He might cut me off entirely. I don't know what to do." I stood there, digesting her words, equal parts furious and stunned. "You lied to all of us?" I finally managed to say. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I didn't know what else to do. Mom and Dad have all these expectations. Maxwell keeps stringing me along." I panicked. A surge of anger coursed through me. 4 years I'd watched our parents idolize her every move, and now she had escalated the charade to a near-catastrophic level. Yet a sliver of pity gnawed at me. She was trapped in a web she'd spun, but the real question was why she felt compelled to spin it in the first place. "How could you do that to them?" I asked, frustration strangling my voice. She let out a choked sob. "They only ever loved me for one reason," she spat, "because they thought I'd marry into money. Without Maxwell's fortune, I'm nothing to them. You think I don't see it? They don't love me for me. They never did." My anger deflated a little as I recognized the sad truth in her words. Lauren, for all her favoritism, was also a victim of their obsession with wealth. We sat down on her expensive couch in silence for a while. She finally told me that Maxwell had left town and refused to answer her calls. His wife was apparently stepping up her legal efforts to protect her assets. Lauren was terrified that she'd be left high and dry. "Dad's been telling everyone about the baby," she said, voice trembling. "He's so proud. I can't bear to tell him the truth. He'll never forgive me." And then, barely above a whisper, she added, "He'll never love me again." I bit my lip. "They'll have to know eventually," I said softly. "You can't hide this forever." She buried her face in her hands. "I know, but maybe I can figure something out before then. Maybe Maxwell will come around, or I'll get pregnant for real." Her words tapered off into desperate silence. It was clear she was grasping at straws. The entire house of cards was collapsing in slow motion, and she was scrambling to keep it upright. I stayed with her for hours, offering what little comfort I could. Deep down I was conflicted. Part of me felt she was reaping what she sowed. Another part recognized that this was a young woman so desperate for our parents' approval that she'd orchestrated a fake pregnancy just to keep it. I decided for the moment to keep her secret, hoping she'd find the courage to tell them herself. But as the weeks trickled by, she remained silent. Meanwhile, my parents ramped up their excitement, buying baby clothes and discussing nursery decor. Every day that passed made the eventual revelation even more devastating. 2 weeks after that, Maxwell reappeared. He summoned Lauren to a final meeting at some upscale cafe. She prepared anxiously, hoping that a face-to-face conversation might salvage their relationship. Instead, he told her she needed to move out of the apartment within the month. He was cutting off any financial ties. "You should have never lied about the baby," he told her flatly. "I'm done." She drove home in tears, devastated. The next day, a lawyer arrived at her door with paperwork clarifying that all the property she'd been enjoying was in Maxwell's name. She had 30 days to vacate. That evening she called me again, sobbing. "I'm ruined," she kept saying. "I have no money of my own. All my bank accounts were basically funded by him. I owe credit card debts I can't pay off." My heart clenched. As much as I'd felt overshadowed by her, this was an ugly downfall, one that could have been prevented if she'd simply lived a more grounded life. I offered to let her crash on my couch for a while, but she seemed too humiliated to accept. "Mom and Dad will help me," she asserted. Yet when she told them the truth about Maxwell's change of heart, she conveniently omitted the fake pregnancy part. They knew he was cutting her off, but they still believed a grandchild was on the way. They rushed to her side, promising financial support and a place to stay if needed. Witnessing the situation, I couldn't help but feel a coil of dread tighten in my gut. Eventually, that baby lie would come to light. Every day I half expected a phone call from my mother, scolding me for being part of the conspiracy. But Lauren claimed she was handling it. She kept me updated, ironically, on how our parents fussed over her, how they insisted on taking her to prenatal appointments, which she faked or canceled last minute, how they wanted to rub her non-existent baby bump. The story was spiraling out of control and I was powerless to stop it. She wouldn't allow me to intervene. Then came the moment of reckoning just a few days ago. My parents demanded that Lauren see a doctor of their choosing, worried about some complications she hinted at to excuse her lack of official prenatal records. Faced with the impossibility of faking an ultrasound or a medical exam, Lauren finally broke down and confessed it all. She was never pregnant. She'd lied because she was scared Maxwell would abandon her, that my parents would withdraw their affection if she wasn't attached to his fortune. Now in one fell swoop she lost their trust. I heard about this explosion secondhand. My mother called me in tears, raging about how Lauren had disgraced the family, how she'd lied to them about something so precious. My father seethed with anger. He even told me that if she stepped into his house again, he'd disown her. The irony wasn't lost on me. They tolerated her becoming a mistress for money, but lying about a pregnancy crossed an unforgivable line. Where was that moral outrage when she first told them she was involved with a married man? Lauren phoned me shortly afterward, sobbing that our parents had thrown her out, that she had nowhere to go. Maxwell's apartment was no longer an option, and her credit cards were maxed out. Despite everything, my heart ached to hear her so broken. I told her she could sleep on my couch for a few nights, no questions asked. When she arrived, she looked hollow, like a ghost of her former self, wearing a worn-out coat, her designer bags replaced with a couple of cheap duffels. She slumped onto my couch, hugging herself as if trying to hold together the shattered pieces of her life. That same evening, I sat down beside her, offered her a mug of tea and hesitantly asked, "What now?" She shook her head, eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know," she choked out. "Mom and Dad won't speak to me. Maxwell's done with me. I have no job, barely any savings. I'm not even sure how to pay next month's bills." It was jarring to see my once glamorous sister confronting a reality she never prepared for. She apologized to me, a raw, trembling apology for how she'd always lorded her status over me, how she'd let our parents worship her while overlooking me. "I see now how messed up it was," she admitted, voice cracking. But I couldn't stop. I wanted them to love me no matter the cost. I was terrified of becoming irrelevant. We spent a long time talking that night. I finally voiced how I'd felt, ignored, overshadowed, perpetually second best. She listened, tears streaking her cheeks, whispering that she never realized how deep my hurt went. "I was so consumed with staying on top," she said softly, "I forgot you even existed in my shadow." Her words, painful as they were, felt like a balm of validation. For once she acknowledged my suffering. As the days passed, we contacted local job agencies and she began drafting a resume. It was surreal to see her rummaging through her old experiences to piece together something that might get her hired. My parents remained unyielding, refusing her calls. My mother's final text message to her was scathing. "You've humiliated us. Don't come near us until you've cleaned up your act." My father wouldn't even pick up the phone. No more lavish dinners, no more celebrations of her success. She was persona non grata in their eyes. Through all this, I realized I was oddly stepping into a caretaker role. The imbalance of our childhood had flipped. Now I was the stable one, the one offering shelter and a sense of direction, while she was lost and fragile. Part of me wanted to relish this shift, to say, "Now you know what it feels like to be sidelined." But most of me felt compassion. She was still my sister, and our parents had done a number on both of us in different ways. Her with unrealistic adoration, me with disregard. She's been on my couch for 2 weeks now, applying for office jobs, waiting to hear back from recruiters. Gone are the high heels and expensive clothes. She sold some of them to pay off a fraction of her debt. Sometimes she'll break down, remember the time she was sipping champagne on a yacht, only to realize she can barely afford groceries now. It's a brutal fall from grace. I haven't seen my parents since they discovered the truth, though they've called me to rant about Lauren's betrayal. I haven't told them she's living with me. I sense it would only spark more drama. Maybe one day we can all talk it out. But for now the family is fractured. The golden child tarnished her crown, and the quiet one picked up the pieces. Life has a twisted sense of humor. Lauren and I have had late-night conversations about the root of everything. She confessed that she's known deep down that our parents' love was conditional. They valued her achievements, or, in this case, her association with a wealthy man, above her character. The fear of losing their approval drove her to extremes. "I wish they'd have loved me for who I am," she said once, "instead of what I could bring to the table." I felt a sting of recognition in those words. I'd always craved that unconditional love too, but never got it. Looking back on my father's remark, "You'll never measure up to your sister," I wonder if he's finally seeing how warped that sentiment was. Maybe one day he'll realize that wealth, status, and outward glamour aren't the only measures of success or worth. But I'm not holding my breath for that revelation. People like my parents are often too rooted in their beliefs to change. As for me, I'm learning that there's a certain peace in living a life free of illusions. I've got a modest condo and a steady job. I don't have a sugar daddy or designer clothes, but I do have independence and self-respect, which Lauren now realizes is worth more than any fancy handbag. She confided that if she could turn back time, she might have chosen a different path, one that didn't revolve around pleasing our parents or chasing Maxwell's riches. But you can't rewrite the past. In a strange way, these past few weeks of living together have started to mend our relationship. We're talking more openly than we ever did. She's seen my day-to-day life, how I hustle at work, how I cook my own meals, pay my own bills, manage my little craft business on the side. She's expressed genuine admiration for my independence, something she never appreciated before. And I've learned that beneath her shiny veneer, she's someone who's been deeply insecure, carrying the burden of our parents' adoration like a yoke around her neck. The future is uncertain. Maybe Maxwell will resurface, maybe not. Maybe our parents will soften, or they might remain unreachable in their anger. For now, we're taking each day as it comes. Lauren's got an interview lined up next week at a small marketing company. If all goes well, she might earn enough to move into her own studio apartment in a month or two. I've agreed to help her find a place, though I also told her she can stay here as long as she needs. This might be the first time in her adult life that she's forging a path without someone else's wallet guiding her. Sometimes I watch her while she's immersed in job hunting, her brow furrowed in concentration, and I wonder if she'll be okay. The transformation from a pampered mistress to an almost penniless job seeker is drastic. But I see a spark of determination in her eyes. It's like she's slowly discovering who she is without Maxwell's shadow or our parents' unrealistic expectations looming over her. And though the situation that brought us here was ugly, I'm grateful for this chance to reconnect as sisters, as equals for once. One night, as we were cleaning up dinner, she quietly asked me, "Do you hate me for how Mom and Dad always treated us?" I paused, dish towel in hand, and admitted, "I did for a long time. But I realize it wasn't your fault. It was theirs. They pinned all their hopes on you and I got shoved aside. That's not on you, though you certainly reveled in it. But you were also a kid who wanted love and approval just like I did." She looked at me, tears glistening. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And in that moment, I forgave her, maybe not entirely but enough to move forward. Life still feels delicate, like one wrong step could send us tumbling back into old resentments. But there's a sense of cautious optimism now. My parents may never learn how to love without strings attached, but we can learn how to live without their validation. Lauren might never recapture the glamorous life she had, but she can find something more meaningful: stability, independence, and real relationships built on honesty rather than money. As for me, I'm slowly letting go of the bitterness that clung to me for so many years. It's not an overnight change, but each day, it gets easier to breathe freely without the suffocating burden of comparisons. Sometimes I think about what my father would say if he saw us now: Lauren perched on my couch, writing cover letters, me cooking dinner after a long day at work. I imagine he'd see two ordinary daughters living ordinary lives, and maybe he'd shake his head in disappointment, longing for the spectacle that once was. But I also imagine a future where we don't need his approval, where I can smile at my reflection, content with my modest achievements, and where Lauren can find happiness in genuine companionship and a job she earns by her own merit. And that's the final twist in this story. The daughter once revered for her ties to $700 million is now the one looking to me for shelter. The parents who adored her have turned their backs. And I, the forgotten child, am the only one willing to offer her a helping hand. It's a dynamic none of us could have predicted. But maybe it's exactly what we all needed to finally see each other, truly see each other, for who we are, free of illusions and outsized expectations. A month ago, if you'd asked me how I felt about my sister, I would have answered with anger, jealousy, and a heavy dose of resentment. Today, I see a woman who was molded by the same flawed family values, someone who made choices out of fear and desperation. She made mistakes, but she's paying for them and trying to move forward. In a strange, twisted way, her fall from grace might be the biggest blessing of all, one that sets both of us on a path to understanding, healing, and maybe even self-worth untethered from our parents' warped standards. So here we are. Two sisters, side by side in a small condo, forging a bond we never had growing up. The mistress of $700 million has become a cautionary tale rather than the family's shining star. And 1 month after her monumental announcement, everything has changed, perhaps for the better. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that wealth can vanish, illusions can shatter, but the core of who we are is what remains. For the first time in my life, I'm starting to believe that the core of who we both are might be strong enough to weather any storm as long as we face it together.